Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Luke Hunt and this is another podcast for the Beyond the Mekong series, which is produced by The Diplomat. And with me today is Keith Richburg. Keith has been with the Washington Post for decades, is one of the region's most outstanding foreign correspondents, and we're going to talk about Donald Trump and what it means for Asia. Keith Richburg, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me.
We're in interesting times and interesting days, so let's just get straight to it. What did you make of the election?
Well, it's funny. We're here in Bangkok where
Yep.
we're recording this. Right about 3 weeks or so before the election, I went to a panel on the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, FCCT, and I was on the panel. We were talking about the election, and I said, "Look, this is the closest election I can remember, and I've been following
Right.
U.S. politics as a young journalist from 1980 when Ronald Reagan was first running against Jimmy Carter. The closest election." It all came down to 7 swing states,
Right.
because of the way the electoral college system works. I mean, 43 states, we all know which way they're going to go. New York, California are going to go blue for the Democrats. Texas, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, they're all going to go red for the Republicans. It really only came down to 7.
Right.
But in that panel, I remember saying, even though it's really close in the polls, it was within 2%, in every poll, I said, I don't think it's going to be a close election. One or the other is going to win all of the swing states.
Right.
I didn't predict that at the time. I said I don't predict that they're going to split the swing states. It didn't make any sense that Harris would win 3 and Trump would win 4. It's going to swing one way or the other. And sure enough, that's what happened. Mm-hmm. And it ended up, I think, at the time we're recording this today, Trump was just announced the winner of the last 2 remaining ones they were still counting, which are
Right.
Arizona and Nevada. So Trump won all 7.
Does that mean they've got control of both houses?
Control of the Senate is confirmed, and
Right.
it's not. They've got 52, which is
Yeah.
out of 100 seats. That's control. They may get 53 or even 54 because they're still counting 2 states.
Okay.
But it doesn't really matter on the final 2 states because 52
That's
is
enough.
control. That's enough. You can control it with an even number because they also will have the vice presidency. The House is up for grabs.
Right.
They still got about 20 seats left. The Republicans are in the best position. They're only a couple of seats short of getting a majority of 218. Democrats have about 202 at the time. It all comes. California just takes forever to count their votes. I mean, we'll be in the next year and they'll still be counting. That's for a variety of reasons. It's the biggest state. California is bigger than 45 other states.
Yeah.
And so they've got so many more votes to count, and everybody gets a mail ballot. Every registered voter in California gets a ballot mailed.
Right.
And, as long as it's postmarked by election day, they still count it. And then, because it's all mail ballots, or mostly mail ballots, if the signature doesn't match the signature on file, under California law, the election worker has to call that voter or find that voter and tell them to come down and let's try to match these signatures. So that just takes forever. So we won't know the results of about maybe 10 or 12 House seats.
Yep.
For another few weeks or so. But again, I think the Republicans will be able to get to the 218 for a majority pretty soon, and they've got a better path than the Democrats have.
Right. I was talking to you about 3-4 months ago, perhaps, and you mentioned then, because I'm not an American. I don't like buying into other countries' politics unless it's for professional reasons and work. But I remember you saying there that the Democrats had to be wary of the increasingly wealthy African American vote, and that as people accumulate more money, as they become more wealthier, they tend to vote more conservative, and that's a win for the Republicans. That seems to have happened. I think you're bang on the money by what.
It's not just that. It's the Latino vote.
Yep.
It's the women's vote, especially white women. If you want to carve the electorate up into different chunks, I mean, and this is the problem I think the Democrats are having now, and they're going through what we call after every election loss, the losing party does what they call an autopsy. Why did we lose? What did we have done? And I think one of the things the Democrats are coming to a conclusion of is that they're used to dividing the electorate up into these different groups. When you go to black community, just talk about criminal justice reform and talk about police reform. When you go to the Hispanic community, talk about immigration. When you go to a labor union, blue collar labor union household, talk about wages and talk about lunch bucket issues. When you go out to talk to suburban moms, talk about family leave, more parental leave. And they've been chopping the electorate up like this. It didn't work this year. because they found that, for example, you go to a Hispanic community in New York or California or Arizona or Nevada, which Harris lost, or Pennsylvania, which Harris lost. All you talk about to this Hispanic group is immigration. We got to have immigration reform. Got to have immigration. A lot of Hispanics couldn't care less about immigration reform because they're already in the country.
I remember watching an interview with a Latino just after the ballots were cast, and this Latino said, as a Latino, myself and my family, we couldn't possibly vote for Kamala Harris because we're Catholic and she supports abortion.
Yeah,
and it was like, whoops.
They're a lot. Most of them from Latin America, at least, are Catholic and they support abortion rights. Many of them, and again, this is really interesting. They came legally, and so what they don't like is they don't like the people coming in illegally after them. Right. And there's somehow the Democrats had this idea that all Latinos care about is reforming the immigration system to allow illegal immigrants to get a path to citizenship. I've got Latino friends who voted for Trump, and they say, no, I want him to shut the border to stop these illegal people coming over. With African Americans, there's a tendency to talk about how horrible the police are, and we have to reform the police, and we have to reduce sentences for nonviolent crimes. You know who most of the victims of crime are in cities in America? Are African Americans. They're victims of crime, and their attitude is, no, we want more police. We want you to lock them up. So so again, I think they kind of misread the electorate in that sense, and they totally missed this whole Zeitgeist or vibe that was out there, really since 2008 when you had the financial crisis, and then followed by COVID, which is just a lot of people, working class people, whether they're white working class, Latino working class, black working class, they feel like the system isn't working for them. They just don't trust the system. They don't trust and have not trusted since 2008 any institutions. They don't trust the press. They don't trust the government. They don't trust the civil service. They don't trust kind of all the traditional institutions. That's why the Washington Post and New York Times, Wall Street Journal, etc., have trouble getting trust among readers. Nobody trusts them. They'd rather hear what somebody has to say on a podcast like this than trust these old institutions.
It's interesting in changing times. What does a Trump victory mean for Asia? We can talk about this till the cows come home. During his last term in office, he did tend to rule by decree, but if he controls both houses, they can do whatever they like. So what does this mean for East Asia, Southeast Asia? But I think we should start with China.
China's going to be the big thing. And, again, I think China, they didn't like the Trump administration, and they probably preferred the Biden administration to some degree. But, again, it's partly because the Chinese like predictability, and Trump is not predictable. And that's what they value most of all in a foreign relationship, is how predict. And they don't know what Trump is going to do. And again, he's going to reignite his trade war. We think. I mean, that's what he said he will do, putting up to 60% tariffs on goods made in China. We don't know if he'll really do that, or we don't know if that's a threat he's making to get the Chinese to come to the table. The one thing about Trump, that we know from Trump first term, and it's going to go into Trump 2.0, is that he's transactional. And a lot of these threats he makes, putting on tariffs, pulling out of NATO, it's a negotiating tactic to then get the other side to come in. So he says he wants to put up to 60% tariffs on Chinese goods, which every economist said would just ruin the U.S. economy, because tariffs are basically a tax on these goods that will get passed down to the consumer. What if the Chinese come in and say, okay, if you don't do that, then we will take another couple of million tons of your U.S. beef. Which, well, sorry for your Australian beef, but if they do that, then it's going to get knocked out of the way. Or what if they say, we'll take another couple thousand tons of this, or we'll take more of your agriculture, more of your soybeans, or more of this or that. That's what the negotiation comes in for. But you just don't know with Trump. The one thing, and the reason I said I think they would prefer Trump to Harris, one reason would be simply that, Tim Walz, the vice presidential candidate, he was very big on Chinese human rights. And I think they were very worried that there might be more of a pro-democracy, human rights agenda from a Harris administration. And I think they know that Donald Trump couldn't care less about any of that. He's very transactional. So that's what and again, the other thing with China that we don't know, because he says a lot of things, but we don't know once he's in office, and we don't know who he's going to surround himself with. We need to wait and see who he names as Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. trade secretary, commerce secretary. But the one thing I would keep an eye on is Taiwan.
Yep.
He's made noises about not wanting to follow our U.S. commitment to help Taiwan defend itself. And nobody knows what that means. It doesn't mean we will give them money to buy weapons to defend themselves. Does it mean the U.S. would extend its own defense capability over Taiwan? That's always been kept ambiguous to keep the Chinese off guard. Trump doesn't do ambiguity well, so he may just come out and say, unless you pay us more money, we're not going to defend you.
It's an interesting playbook in that, from my perspective as an Australian, oh, God, I get tired of it all when I get home. All these Australian analysts are talking up a conflict between Australia and China, and it's complete nonsense. That's not going to happen. It's not the way it works. Australia doesn't go anywhere unless America's there first, for a start. The Brits and the French, they've made their presence known, and of course, what it really boils down to is the Japanese and the Koreans, and of course the Taiwanese, and the Philippines are right next door, and all these countries are well in with American foreign policy. They are right on board at the moment. So is it possible that Trump, with his Taiwan shenanigans, might disrupt that?
I think Trump is definitely going to disrupt that. The one thing we know about Trump, again, it depends on who he surrounds himself with in Trump 2.0, but at least in Trump 1.0, he does not like alliances.
Right.
He prefers bilateral dealings, one-on-one with countries.
Yep.
The Biden administration was completely different. And in order to contain China, and that's what they really were doing, containing what they consider China's expansionist tendencies in South China Sea with Taiwan, Hong Kong, they built these alliances. They built the Quad, which would include Australia, India, Japan. They built this new alliance with the Philippines and Vietnam. So the Biden administration was all about, let's build alliances around China. Korea, Japan. They got Korea and Japan talking to each other as a counter to China. Trump will disrupt all of that. He couldn't care less about alliances.
Yep.
And so we don't know, is there a future for the Quad? Probably it might exist in name only, but I doubt there'll be a meeting of the Quad with Trump at the helm.
I'm wondering where that leaves ASEAN, and I just wrote a column about this, in that under the Biden administration, the State Department and its influence on Canberra and other countries in the region that surround Southeast Asia, the attitude was, we want ASEAN to be a centrist power. We want ASEAN to be the go-to negotiating bloc for issues like the South China Sea, Myanmar. Now, ASEAN hasn't done a very good job, and it's been split by countries like Cambodia, Laos and Myanmar. But it's a little bit like ASEAN, if it wants to continue to be relevant, given Trump is about to re-enter on centre stage, what would they? What do you think they should do?
That's really interesting. The ASEAN bloc, they have never really operated as a bloc, as like the EU, the European Union, because they don't have a common foreign policy. They don't have a common political policy. There's not a common human rights policy like you have in the European Union. What you have is a dozen separate countries, all with competing economies and with competing interests in some ways. And they span the spectrum between democracies in Indonesia and the Philippines, all the way to military dictatorships in Myanmar, to absolute monarchies, if you count the Sultan of Brunei and Thailand being somewhere in between. It's a mix. So they don't have a common theme or a common policy. They also all have separate bilateral trade agreements with different partners, and many of them with the United States, like Singapore, for example, Thailand. Most use China as their principal trading partner. So it's a mixed block. So it's almost impossible to make the ASEAN countries your main negotiating partner. That's going to suit, I believe, Trump 2.0 just fine, because he prefers bilateral dealings with countries as opposed to dealing with countries as a bloc. Now, I've actually already been seeing in Thailand, for example, some government officials are starting to say Trump victory is great for them. Why? Because tension with China means he slaps tariffs on China. A lot of American companies are going to want to get out of China and have their goods made somewhere else, so they're not assembled in China. They might be slapped with tariffs. Thailand's the natural place.
And we've seen that happen already, garments and
absolutely.
other production.
And you could actually end up seeing this whole idea of, some people call it decoupling the U.S. and Chinese economy. Some people call it de-risking, whatever you call it. But if companies decide that, look, the U.S. and China are splitting into two rival blocs, I don't want to be in China, I might as well move my my operations to somewhere in Southeast Asia.
And certainly a lot of companies, the big brands have diversified in that respect, in that they initially about 10 years ago they started to build factories. Well, we'll have one in Cambodia and we'll have one in Nepal and we'll have just in case.
Spread
the risk.
Spread the risk, and don't forget COVID. I mean, we couldn't get face masks in the United States. We couldn't get medical supplies in the United States because most of it was made in China, and we had basically subcontracted all of that to China. We didn't make it anymore in the U.S. And the Chinese, when COVID hit, suddenly said, "Sorry, we're not going to export this stuff, even though you've already paid for it and commissioned it because we need it here."
Right.
Yeah.
You've been in the region a long time. I remember the first days I really came across you because you were so well known. It was in Hong Kong, 1997. You were the president of the FCC, the Foreign Correspondents Club. You did a sterling job, I might add.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, I look back then, I was just a kid. You know, what I thought didn't matter. But when you look at kind of the decades that have followed since then, it's been a hell of a ride. How do you stack up the years? And you've had some difficult ones as well.
Oh yeah, look, I mean, it's watching this region over the last 30 or 40 years has been fascinating. I first came to Southeast Asia in 1986 to cover the Philippines. I covered the end of the Marcos regime right after the People Power Revolution that toppled Ferdinand Marcos. I came in September of '86. He left in February or so, and now you got a Marcos back in power.
Well, it's Trump at the moment. I mean, he swung things back from. Duterte was heading right into China's arms, and Marcos has brought it back.
And in 1997, what we were talking about, I mean, that was the Asian financial crisis. People remember the Hong Kong handover. It was also the year of the Asian financial crisis.
Yep.
The next year, that financial crisis helped topple the Suharto regime.
Yes, it did.
And now the guy who was the head of Suharto's special forces is now the president.
Subianto.
Yeah, Subianto. It was Prabowo. And so, it's really funny because some people say to me about Trump, don't people remember the chaos and the craziness and the carnival of the Trump years? I say, yeah, but look around the region here. How many times have we seen people come back? Because it doesn't look as bad in retrospect.
I understand the puritanicals. I understand the idea that a person convicted of a felon shouldn't really be the leader of a country, particularly a democracy in a Western country. But there's a lot of leaders around the world who have extremely dodgy records, and Subianto Prabowo is one of them. He was banned from the United States for 20 years. He only had his visa status reinstalled about 3 or 4 years ago.
That's because he was defense secretary and they had to let him in.
Well, indeed, we're talking dollars too.
And look here in Thailand, Thaksin. Thaksin was in exile for I don't know how many years, floating around with various corruption charges, and then suddenly he gets kind of a royal pardon, and he's back now.
Exactly. I'm just wondering.
Anwar Ibrahim, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, was in prison for many years. Sodomy charges, which are
that's just.
But I mean, how many? So you've seen plenty of leaders here who are on one side, then the other side. They're brought back, they're redeemed.
No one in Southeast Asia asked.
Exactly, and actually, and again, it's worth pausing there and just talking about that for a moment here, which is. Most voters didn't care about the felonies, because most voters looked at that and said, "What was he actually convicted of? What were first of all the 34 felonies?" Well, it was actually one charge. The charge was that he used money to pay off this porn star with whom he had a relationship. He claims it didn't happen. She says it did. He paid off money. It was his own personal money, but they say that was an illegal campaign contribution. The only reason it's 34 felonies is, I think, because he spaced out the payments, and so therefore each check he wrote became a different felony.
Right.
But it was, the whole thing was basically just one case. And so the case was basically, he was accused of having sex with a porn star. This guy, Michael Cohen, paid her off, and then he repaid Michael Cohen out of his own checkbook. A lot of people look at that and say, who cares?
Yeah.
Who really cares about that? Is that really a campaign finance violation? And if it was so bad, this thing supposedly happened before he was elected in 2016. Why did they wait until 2024 to bring the charge and prosecute him for this? I mean, come on. And by a Democratic prosecutor in New York City who basically said, I'm going to take Donald Trump down. So, a lot of people looked at this, including people who can't stand Donald Trump, and said, that's kind of a weird thing. And I'll go back. You can trace a direct line. My liberal friends hate me when I say this. You can trace a direct line between Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. Bill Clinton was impeached after admitting to having an affair with a White House intern and then lying about it under oath, which is perjury. Right. He was asked about it in a deposition. He lied, said, no, I did not have sex with that woman. Turns out he did. He was impeached but never convicted, so because they couldn't convict him in the Senate. Although a lot of senators thought his behavior was reprehensible. The Democrats at the time, all the Democratic supporters, all the Clinton supporters, rallied around Bill Clinton. And they said, we couldn't care less who he's having sex with. We can't care less about his personal life or what he did with. We don't like it, but we don't care. Yep. He's putting in place policies that we Democrats like. So we don't care about his personal life. So it's a bit rich to turn around with Donald Trump and start trying to use his personal life, who he's had sex with, porn stars and all that against him, after they said with Bill Clinton, it doesn't matter. You can trace a direct line between what happened with Bill Clinton when the Democrats saved him. Yeah. They wouldn't vote to impeach him in the Senate because they said, we don't care. He's ours. He's our guy.
At the end of the day, it's all about the voters. So I think Bernie Sanders summed it up well when he said that how can the Democrats expect the working class to support them when they had abandoned the working classes anyway, which is interesting coming from him. Yeah. Going back to Indonesia, that's the one country I'm having something of a struggle in terms of. Indonesia is a powerhouse of the region. It's a country that matters, its size, its economy. How do you think relations will stack up between Washington and Indonesia? Also, I'd just quickly add that I think most people are well aware that foreign policy is not Trump's strong point, and I suspect there's going to be something of a free-for-all among the countries. One's going to have to yell louder and harder than the other to get their attention. But how do you think Indonesia will stack up?
That's a really good question. Indonesia has always tried to stay and has stayed non-aligned. And non-aligned between China, Russia, and the United States, trying to keep good relations with all of them. And as a consequence of that, I think, or trying to stay non-aligned, Indonesia has never, in my view, taken the role it could play in Southeast Asia or in the ASEAN bloc. They tend to kind of not play to their weight. They play below their weight. They never want to stand up to China and help the other, and politically, diplomatically bolster the other countries that have claims in the South China Sea. They just don't want to do that. They don't want to play that role. The military, there's good military relations between Indonesia and the United States. A lot of the military officers, perhaps even Prabowo, I have to check that, actually trained or did some training in the United States, so there's a lot of connections with the military there. But they're gonna buy their military hardware from everybody. Right. They're not going to be totally reliant on the United States. They're not going to be totally reliant on China. They're right there. So they've never actually pitched to their weight. The best relationship I think Indonesia had with the U.S. was during the Obama administration. And I think because Obama spent a little bit of time in his youth living in Indonesia. He had some connections there. I think his sister had some Indonesian connection, or so there was and when he traveled there, it was like a rock star coming home. Yep. And some people say the previous president, Jokowi, actually looked like Obama somewhat, and actually modeled his campaign on kind of this Obama outsider guy coming in as a kind of a reformist in the system, kind of too. And they had very good relations. Obama traveled there. Good. It was like a homecoming because he had lived in Indonesia before. But with the Trump administration, the irony is that Kamala Harris didn't have a lot of foreign policy experience, but she spent more time in Southeast Asia than any other place. Right. And that's partly because it just wasn't on the Biden administration's agenda. So what do? You send the vice president. Okay. So whenever there was an East Asia meeting or an ASEAN meeting or somebody had to go to Asia, they'd send Kamala Harris. So she actually made several trips out here. I think she's been to Vietnam and the Philippines. She's met Marcos more than any other world leader. So she would have actually probably elevated Southeast Asia.
Trump a bit more into the mix. Do you think human trafficking and the scam compounds, which is, I'm having trouble explaining how the sheer scale, the sheer size of what's going on to people outside the region. I think that's partly because all the victims are Asian or Central Asians and Africans, and that's pretty hard to get on the radar in America or Australia or Canada, New Zealand, and Although these countries now, a lot more victims are coming from the West, so that's putting it a bit more on the radar. And I just, with the previous administration, I am under the impression they had a plan.
Yeah.
They started by sanctioning businessmen like Leon Phat in Cambodia, and at the same time we all know that it's pretty difficult to get anything done out of Washington during an election year. So I am kind of curious as to where this might go next. Also because the US Treasury doesn't like to see the dollar being compromised by these sorts of illegal industries.
Well, that's right. I don't know if the Trump administration is going to have that on its agenda. I fear that with this America First policy, as you mentioned, because there are not a lot of Americans involved in this, that it's going to be very hard to get their attention on this. The one thing it might come through to is when they start negotiating with China. Because if they can tell China that, look, it's your job to crack down on some of these things, particularly the ones going over the border into Myanmar, that might be one way. And again, this America First policy means they're not going to be paying attention to what's happening in Haiti. They probably couldn't care less about trying to solve problems in Africa, like Sudan and the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia. They probably couldn't care less about Myanmar. But the one way you could probably get their attention on Myanmar is to say, look, because of this collapse of the government, the junta in Myanmar is basically pushed back to the capital and to Rangoon. The only way you can get the Trump administration's attention on this, say, because this place has become a lawless, stateless place now and under control of various ethnic armies, drug production is higher than ever before.
Right.
And it's probably now surpassed or is at least equal to Afghanistan in terms of the amount of illicit heroin going into the United States. And so therefore, it's America First means helping solve the Myanmar issue. Not because you care about what happens with Myanmar, but because you don't want drugs coming out and going into the United States. Fentanyl coming out of China. That's a leverage point that you could use with the Chinese
and
as
Trump
well.
did, if I remember correctly, one of his first policy actions by decree was to try and crack down on fentanyl.
Exactly.
That's one of his big...
Exactly. And so look for that. Again, I mean, you put 60% tariffs on China. And by the way, the Biden administration kept most of the earlier Trump tariffs.
Yeah.
But you say, but then the Chinese will come to the table and say, okay, what do you want? How do we get rid of these tariffs? Okay, shut down the fentanyl. Go over into Myanmar and shut down the drug trafficking, that kind of thing.
And of course, the other major hotspot in the region is Korea, North Korea. Relations obviously dependent upon what happens with China, I guess, in many ways. But given that North Koreans are also sending troops to Russia fight in Ukraine, I mean, that's a game changer as well.
That's frightening. North Korea is frightening. They just launched a longer range missile in the direction of Japan, the East China Sea there. That we don't. Again, that's frightening. We don't know what's going to happen because don't forget, in the first term, Trump became the first U.S. president to actually negotiate with directly, face to face, with the North Koreans. He met Kim Jong-un a couple of times. They met in Singapore. They met in Vietnam. They started a bromance. He said, I think he said we fell in love.
Oh, and you walked across the border into open
They walked
arms.
across the border. They held hands. I mean, so we don't know. Are they going to revive their bromance?
Yeah.
Or is it going to be what it was like in the earlier part of Trump 1.0 when they were trading names back and forth, where Trump was saying, I've got a bigger button than you have, and he called him a dotard and all this. So I'd rather have them holding hands and kissing than launching nukes at each other and blaming each other for that. So that's
with a lot of these countries around the region is that they really want that attention. They crave that attention, and it's almost like a problem child that's going to just create havoc until it gets the attention it desires.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I think, just in terms of Southeast Asia in general and the ASEAN countries, the other reason I think they might like a Trump victory, number one is because, I mentioned, is because of China, the trade war, and U.S.-China tension means more economic activity might move to Southeast Asia. The second reason is Biden put it as a centerpiece of his foreign policy, and it was called democracy promotion.
Yes,
and they would go around the world talking about democracy. He would scold Thailand, or the State Department would scold Thailand for banning the Move Forward Party. They would scold Cambodia for arresting dissidents, scold Vietnam for holding dissidents in jail, scold Singapore, for its that's going to be gone. The democracy agenda is gone.
Yeah, it was an interesting policy by Biden because he basically divided the world between democratic countries and not democratic countries, which, when I look back at the time, I got where he was coming from, but that won't be appropriate now.
Well, the problem with the Biden policy, and again, I believe in democracy and I believe in human rights, but the problem is it ran smack into realpolitik, because after the Russians invaded Ukraine, suddenly, and the oil from Russia was shut off because of sanctions, suddenly we had to go to Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Saudi Arabia chopped up a journalist, the Washington Post
contributing
columnist.
One of your colleagues.
One of my colleagues from the Washington Post, and this was a horrific crime against the journalist. But Biden went to meet him, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, and fist bumped him. I mean, again, so he ended up not supporting his own, or not promoting his own democracy promotion agenda when it became time to cut corners because realpolitik intervened. And so I think it'll be a lot easier for Trump to come in and say, well, look, Biden never really upheld democracy everywhere. He only did it in places where we could. And we only did it really kind of rhetorically. We didn't back it up with a whole lot of things. And so that's why I think the Trump administration is not even going to put democracy or promotion or human rights on its agenda. It's going to be strictly transactional. What are you going to give us? How much trade are you going to give us? You're going to buy our stuff. You're going to, et cetera. That's how the Trump administration operates. None of these high ideals about democracy. As far as I could tell from Trump 1.0, there's no strategy behind it. There's no overarching strategy.
COVID happened as well. Well,
COVID, yeah.
There was no strategy, and there was, I think, Trump left 400 positions in the State Department vacant.
Yes.
And then COVID happened, which kind of probably put a lid on what he wanted to do, as well as everybody else.
Well, that's correct.
So
that's correct. Now, the one place that he actually had good relations, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, is India.
Okay.
Don't forget, right before COVID hit the U.S., Trump's last foreign trip as president was to India. And he and Modi had a good relation. There was a huge, outpouring for Trump there. I think he liked Modi. They're both kind of authoritarian leaders who don't like the constraints of a free press, and they don't like to be criticized. They don't like a judiciary, that comes against them. So I think he and Modi were one of a kind in that sense. Illiberal leaders elected through a democratic process who, once elected, didn't like to be hemmed in by the traditional checks and balances. I think he sees a like-minded figure in Modi. It'll be interesting, again, just like Kim Jong-un, to see if he could revive that bromance once he's back in the White House.
I think you summed that up very well. We're drawing to a close. How do you think we'll go over the next 2 or 3 years? Where do you see yourself in that mix? Because I guess the clouds are starting to clear.
Well, it's interesting. I think we're going to once again see the carnival of chaos that we saw from 2016 up until COVID started. America, according to our election cycle, we have too many elections as far as I'm concerned. Right. The House of Representatives, the lower house of Congress, it's elected every 2 years. And so if the traditional cycle holds, Trump will have about this carnival of chaos will go on for about the first year through 2025. He'll take the oath of office January 20th. For about 1 year to 1.5 years, till the summer of 2026. You're going to just have this typical kind of chaos. He's going to appoint people who are horrific. He's going to start rolling back regulations. We didn't even mention climate change. He's going to pull out of all kinds of climate accords. Everybody's going to be horrified and appalled. But then we're going to start getting ready for the November 2026 midterm elections. And my prediction is it's going to be so chaotic and so typical Trump that people are just going to recoil at it. And then the Democrats will come back and win the House, probably definitely, and then maybe even have a good chance to take the Senate because there are more Republicans running in 2026, just because the way the system works. There'll be more Republican seats up in 2026. And so then for 2026, I suspect you'll see this big anti-Trump Democratic wave come back in when people get so revulsed at the carnival of chaos going on. And then after the midterms, which is November of 2026, you're going to start seeing Democrats coming out and announcing that they're going to run for president in 2028. And so and don't forget, Trump's a lame duck. The minute he takes the oath of office, he can't run again. So a lot of attention is going to start saying, okay, who's going to come after Trump? Who's going to clean up this chaos? The Republicans might split between those who say, let's continue the MAGA, Make America Great Again banner, versus the traditional Republicans who say, let's take our party back. The Democrats will be split between those on the left, maybe Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, Josh Shapiro, and the center, Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, candidate for vice president who didn't make it. They're going to be arguing over which direction should the Democrats go to be able to take things back again. And so we'll be consumed by politics again in 2 years. So I suspect Trump's got a narrow window to kind of try to impose his will before people start looking beyond Trump.
And in the meantime, it's going to be a hell of a ride. Keith Richburg, thanks very much. It was a great chat.
All right, thanks much.
Cheers, mate.